Hello and welcome to the last of our reviews of the 1990s Scalextric cars that we've been doing. So there are 6 cars within this review series. Please just check the details in the description for more information. If you've not seen one of these before, there are 3 parts to it. The first is we'll have a quick chat about the one-to-one car that we're going to be doing reviews on. The second part is a more detailed look. We have an overhead camera looking at the details of the Scalextric car itself. And then the third part of the review is a track test to see how the car itself performs. Now, we are looking at the McLaren MP4/12 today. This is the number 9 car driven by Mika Hakkinen. This car first appeared in the 1998 Scalextric catalogue. Albeit it was the number 10 livery of David Coulthard. Now, in the 1998 catalogue, they listed the number 9 car as not illustrated. So the first time we actually see a picture of the number 9 car is in the 1999 catalogue. Now, what's interesting about this is that the car itself is listed as the McLaren MP4/10. The MP4/10 and the MP4/11, from the research I've done, only ever appeared in the Marlboro livery, whereas the MP4/12 that we're going to be looking at, and indeed the MP4/13 that we're going to be talking about, were the West Tobacco Company livery that we see in front of us here. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a sec. So Mika Hakkinen drove this McLaren Mercedes to win the Formula 1 Championship and indeed the Constructors Championship in 1998 and 1999. Mika was one of those flying Finns, as they are described, who did extremely well within all forms of motorsport. This particular car and Mika were up against the likes of Michael Schumacher, who was driving for Ferrari, David Coulthard, who was Mika's teammate, and Damon Hill racing for Williams. It was a very interesting era. In 1997, so the year before this particular car was built, Adrian Newey joined McLaren, and again for all the F1 fans, Adrian Newey is highly regarded as one of the best F1 engineers out there. So he had joined McLaren, hadn't had any influence on the 1997 car, but he did have some input into this 1998 car. Now with F1, we tend to talk about F1 with regard to rule changes. That's what dictates what the cars look like. And there are big rules changes. There are things that come in that will greatly affect the downforce of the car and require a complete rework of all of the bodywork. This car, and indeed the MP4, the 10, the 11, the 12, the 13, they're all largely the same. I mean, there weren't any massive rule changes that would affect them within that period. So effectively, they were building on a platform rather than redesigning a car from scratch. So to call this an MP10 versus an MP13, there really isn't that many differences. I'm sure there are people out there, I'm not sure, I know there are people out there that could identify those differences and point them out. But to the more casual user, to somebody who's just sort of looking at this car as a whole, you won't really see any differences, to be honest. There was one sort of major change coming up, but nothing at this stage. So that's a bit of a background on the car. So labelled by Scalextric as an MP4/10, very clearly either an MP4/12 or 13, but of course I would say 12 because they'd have to have a crystal ball to see what the number 13 would look like. The last interesting point about this car, or rather its predecessor, the MP413, is that it held the hill climb record at the Festival of Speed at Goodwood for 20 years. So in 1999, it broke the hill climb record, and that record stayed for 20 years. So quite an impressive vehicle in the whole. But if we think back about Scalextric and their sort of tendency to go after really good cars and famous cars, it doesn't get much better than this, really. If you think about it, Mika Hakkinen drove it to the Formula 1 F1 World Championship, McLaren won the Constructors Championship, and it was, or at least had input by Adrian Newey, the famous F1 designer. So for all intents and purposes, this car should be extremely popular amongst collectors. But of course, course, as you know, if you've looked at the introduction, what I do, these cars are all bought cheaply off of eBay, and this is no exception. Anyway, without further ado, what I want to do is take a closer look, and we'll start to talk about some of those details with regard to the decals and the design, using the overhead camera so that we can see it more clearly. Okay, see you in a second. Hello, welcome back. So now we've got the overhead camera, we can have a look in more detail at the car itself. So overall, the look of the car is good. The actual physical mouldings, the wings, the nose cone, the driver area, the rear spoilers, everything is pretty well done, including these deflector shields as well. So overall, the car itself is fine. So really what we're looking at are the decals to understand how accurate they are. Now with Formula One cars, certainly of this era, if you remember me saying about the MP4/10 and the MP4/11, they were sponsored, or their main sponsor, I should say, was Marlboro. So they were red and white, and they had the Marlboro writing on the car itself. This car's main sponsor, and indeed the MP4/13, so the 12 and the 13, their main sponsor is a company called West. Now, West Tobacco obviously are a company that you may or may not know. Smoking isn't very popular anymore, like it was back in the 90s and the 80s. So West was a tobacco manufacturer, and what they had was they had the logo West. It was W-E-S-T written across the car, and if you Google this car, you'll see many pictures of it with a big West sign at the back here, West down the side pods, West written all over. However, during that period of time, there were countries where it was unacceptable to advertise tobacco or alcohol to main sponsors of Formula One. And so what the teams came up with was a different livery, an international livery, you might want to call it, but a livery that wouldn't have that in-your-face advertising. And that's what we see here. However, and again, the really interesting point is that this logo here, and you see it on the rear spoiler, on the front spoiler, on the left and the right, and down on the side pods, this is actually the West logo. It's just that it's a very obscure West logo, and I'll post an image of the West logo up now so you can see that. So it's this sort of square box with the two people, the red person and the clear white person, holding hands. Now, because it was so obscure, I believe that McLaren made the decision that this would be the international look and feel. Now, the other differences, if we think about differences between the car here, the 13 and the 14, was that the tyre sponsor changed from Goodyear for the MP4/12, which is what this is. Let me just put that up the right way for you. They changed from Goodyear to Bridgestone, and that would obviously be reflected on the tyres, but it was also reflected here as well. There was a B for Bridgestone. The logo Bridgestone would be on the front of the nose cone there. And indeed this red mark here changed as well for the MP4/13. So that's why I feel reasonably confident, even though Scalextric have defined this as an MP4/10, I feel reasonably confident that this is an MP4/13. Everything else is pretty good, I would say, with regard to the decals. They're all over this car. I see the decals that I see on the main car itself. So I think Scalextric have done an absolute cracking job. This was a licensed car as well. So indeed, you would see the note within the catalogue saying that this was licensed by McLaren. The only place where they really dropped the ball, I would say, is on the driver. This is nothing like Mika Hakkinen's helmet, and this is nothing like the overalls that Mika Hakkinen would be wearing. So they could have, just gone that extra step and made this an extremely classic car. So let's take the top off and have a look underneath and see how this car is put together. There are 4 screws that hold this together. I've removed 3 of them. So we flip her over, we see as we've got used to now, our quick release guide. So we can move that off, and that indeed hooks into the powertrain of the car via these 2 tabs. The car itself is a magna traction car. Let me get that screw out. So you can see at the back here, we have our brown magnet. So these are the weaker magnets, nothing like the neodymiums that we see in today's cars. So the top comes off, the
all the components of the car are part of that. So they're all put in there, they're all glued on or clipped on. You can pull bits and pieces off like that. So that is very nicely done. And then we have the actual shell of the car itself. As with most of our Formula One cars, the axle is easily removable. Some of them are held in just by these sort of channels within the chassis itself. So unlike our previous 1990s cars where the axles are clipping into something, even though they're wobbly, this one is just channels where the axle itself rests, and then they have more detailing clipped onto the axles to show the sort of brake ducts and the wishbones and a thought of the suspension as well that comes across on that particular part. Aside from that, we have our usual clips that hold our car in the rear axle into the car itself. We have some more suspension detailing here, which is quite nice. We have a reasonably flat chassis, so there's plenty of room if we wanted to add weight down either side there, we could do that. And we have our usual clips that attach our power to the motor, and then we've got our standard motor. So a very, again, a very standard layout, one that we're getting quite used to. And again, we've got this nice deflector shield in here. I'm not going to remove that because I need to remove those wires, but that is actually removable just like the rest of the body shell itself. So all in all, a nice looking car. The difference here, or one of the differences, or at least something that's worth noting, is that there are 4 screws that hold this together. And I think that's down to the detail of the body. It's quite a complicated design. So the last thing I want to do, and as I said before many times, is I understand that you can't actually see these numbers on the video, but what we're doing is we're testing the magnetic downforce of this car against this magnet. The magnet itself goes against this metal plate here. So the first thing we do is we weigh the car. In this case, we only have a few bits and pieces of the car, but it doesn't matter because what we do is we zero that weight. And then what we place is we place the magnet itself over this part of the bar, and that will then give us the amount of magnetic downforce that this car has got. So that is 32.9 grams of downforce, which is whopping amount of downforce. So 32, 33, so we call that the 30 to 35 grams of downforce, which is a very large amount for the cars that we've been looking at so far. So given that we've got such a strong amount of downforce, that downforce itself is mainly incumbent to how low the car itself is. So it's got a very low center of gravity. We've got some very wide tyres here at the rear. I'm expecting this car to perform extremely well on our track test. So without further ado, I'll put the car back together again and I will meet you out on the track.
Okay, welcome back to the track. So if you've not seen these before, down here we have the previous 5 cars that we have tested. So you can see that the top of the list there is the Opel Calibra V6, and it had a magnetic downforce of 20 to 25 grams and it did a lap in 6.3 seconds. And then you can see all the other cars and their magnetic downforce. So this car has 30 to 35 grams of downforce, which is the same as our Jaguar XJ8, or the XJR9 as I call it. I'm expecting this to do very well. The difference between the Jaguar and the Opel is that the Jaguar had much worse tyres than the Opel. So it is faster than most of the other cars, but that's mainly down to the fact that it had a good strong set of magnets. The tyres were okay, but they weren't as good as they could be. What we do is we do 5 laps. The idea is not to do the 5 fastest laps, but to do 5 laps that you see me drive without coming off. That's the important part, which means that I'm going slightly slower than I would normally do on a very fast lap. We have a lap timing system here that will call out the laps as we go past the start-finish line so that you can hear them, and then we'll look at the lap times afterwards and we'll compare it to the other cars that we've tested within this series of 1990s catalogue Scalextric cars. So without further ado, I'm going to hit start and I'm going to drive around the track. So the first lap is now lap. This doesn't get counted. It's the next time I go through the start-finish line that we'll start scoring.
0.00. 5.7. 5.6. 5.7.
Alrighty, so as predicted, this car is very fast. Now, we did a top speed there of 5.63, so 5.63, not quite a second faster, but certainly 3/4 of a second faster than our Opel Calibra V6. For me personally, I'm happy with that in terms of this is a Formula 1 car, it's a very fast Formula 1 car, it should be the quickest car on that list, without a doubt. Today's track is slippier than normal. As you can see, I'm in an outbuilding here and we had quite windy conditions last night, so there's a lot of dust got shook down onto the track. That said, the car still performed very well. It has some nice soft rear tyres. These are the originals. It's got low down centre of gravity. It's got a good sort of general geometry with regards to the distance from the guide to the rear wheel. So I expected it to do well. But 5.63 is a very, very respectable time for any slot car to go around this track. And indeed, that is shown there with that car. So all in all, very happy with that. I think what we've seen in this series though is we have seen and is reflected in those times over there the impact of the magnet on the cars and how they perform. And indeed our two slowest cars, the Jaguar and the Sierra at the bottom there with 15 to 20 grams of magnetic downforce. Then we have the Audi A4 with 20 to 25. We have our out of position Opel Calibra V6. That really should have been below the Jaguar, and the Jaguar XJ9 R9 would have been above. And that would be the case if I replaced the tyres on that Jaguar XJ8. If I gave that stronger, grippier tyres, it would indeed go quicker than the Opel Calibra. And then that said, if we then looked at that list in that order, from a perspective, and this is quite childish, I know, but from a perspective of wanting to buy a car, one car's quicker than the other because this is a Formula 1 car, it should go quicker than a rally car. And then if we had a road car, well, that should potentially be slower than a rally car. So in terms of the order that I would have expected to see those cars, F1 car I would have expected to be the number one. The Jaguar XJ220 I would have expected to be either number 2 or number 3, with the Jaguar XJ8 number 2 or number 3. Not really sure exactly on those two. My hunch would tell me that the Jaguar XJ8 would be slightly quicker than the 220, and then I would expect to see the Audi A4 and the Sierra. Again, not sure which way around those two would go. So more effect of magnets on these cars. As we head into 2000, now we're going to see a very different look and feel to the cars, because now we're seeing the introduction of neodymium magnets, I can never say that word, which have a much greater downforce and therefore affect the cars in a much greater way and bring a lot more parity perhaps to the cars. But we'll see that as we head into that series. But for now, thank you very much for watching this series. If you've missed any of these, they're all listed in the description below. You'll have a link through to an introduction, and from that introduction you'll have access to all 6 car videos, and you can just jump to the track tests or listen to me ramble on for the full 15 minutes. With regard to tyre preparation, again, there's a link in the description which you can go and look at, and that will show you how to get the most out of your tyres, whether they're the original tyres or whether they're new sets of tyres. It makes no difference. I treat them all the same, and indeed silicons or rubbers. I treat everything the same, just slightly less with silicons than I do with the rubbers. All right. Please subscribe. I'm going to be doing a series of one-off videos. We're going to be looking at some rally cars, and we're going to be looking at some designing of cars. We're going to be looking at how to paint cars as well. So there's a whole series of videos coming up that aren't necessarily related to the Scalextric catalogues themselves, but equally they are all Scalextric or slot car related. So if you want to see more of that, please subscribe and you won't miss anything. Thank you very much, and take care. Bye-bye.